So, I had myself a little Dan Barker revival of late. Dan Barker? Yeah, I'll explain it. So, I don't know who posted the original video. I guess it was Ron. Someone in one of my Christian chat groups posted a commentary on Dan Barker. And then I think it was Jay from England mentioned, he's not too crazy about Dan Barker because he's kind of one of these sloppy old school style atheists. And I seconded the motion. But what it did was it sparked something in me. And, I just got kind of curious and put the name Dan Barker into Google search. And I stumbled upon this nugget, this gold nugget from the past that was really entertaining and interesting. Apparently, Dan Barker was on Oprah Winfrey. I kid you not. This is what appeared in my Google search, circa 1984. Oprah Winfrey, 1984, with Annie Gaylor was the person, Freedom of Religion Foundation, who later went on to become his Mrs. Dan Barker. I guess they got married, and I guess they're still married today. I didn't, delve deep enough to find out if they're still married. But so it was really interesting. I started watching this old Oprah show where basically it was atheism, I couldn't believe it. Now, for those of you who are young and don't really know, a lot of you might not know who Oprah Winfrey is or was back then. But back then in the 80s, okay, talk shows, daily talk shows were a really big market thing, and Oprah was the queen of them. That's big market TV. So that means atheism had officially arrived. That broadcast was probably seen by north of 10, 15 million people. I mean, that's a pretty big thing. Talk shows were huge back then, and Oprah was the biggest person on the talk show circuit. She's I think still to this day the richest African-American woman, I think. That tells you, she started her own production company. But so this was really interesting. This is like atheism had arrived. Now, watching it, I got a couple of key insights that I will share with you. The first thing that was very illuminating was one of the things on offer, particularly by this Annie Gaylor, the soon-to-be Mrs. Dan Barker. Atheism back then, couple key observations. First of all, the talking points that she said then, you could have literally copied and pasted her and Dan Barker and put them in a YouTube video today. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. They haven't improved this at all. They haven't updated it at all. You could literally copy and paste her, put her in a YouTube video today, nobody would notice. But back then, one of the things that it offered that I'm trying to tell you it doesn't actually have was the illusion of formal rigor. That's the thing that I noticed. That's the takeaway. That's the lead. It offered you the illusion, hey, these guys are really firing on all 5 cylinders. So she does some things that nowadays are considered standard atheist talking points. But back then they must have really seemed to people, because nobody knew any better back then, right? Some of the people in the audience start trying to do apologetics with them. Apologetics basically didn't exist back then. There were a handful of apologists, but not as we know it today. One guy starts trying to say to her, like, how do you have values and how do you have morals? And she starts doing, well, the Old Testament is just like, the first four commandments of the 10 commandments aren't really moral at all. They're about God telling you what to do. She was, to tell you the truth, my apologies, Dan, she's a little annoying. She was a little bit of a proto-wokester, and like, she mentions the male God, worshiping the male God about 10 different times. She makes mention of the fact that it's a male God. So that tells you where her head was at. She was a little bit annoying. But at first glance, then someone else asks about, and she does there are 32,000 different denominations. So a lot of Christians don't even know what it is that they actually believe. Now, at first glance, it seems like she was offering up devastating critiques of religion in general, Christianity in particular. If you don't know any better, and back then nobody knew any better, that's my point. There wasn't really apologetics as an industry. So nobody knew that some of the stuff that she had on offer, nothing's changed. She copy paste her today, put her in a YouTube video today, be the same arguments. So it's very interesting. Why? Because they're totally irrelevant. The 32,000 different denominations is a standard. It's a favorite. I think even Matt Dillahunty, I was watching a debate with him very recently as 2 weeks ago, and he mentioned it. Now, I don't know if he's still mentioned in the last 3 years, but he mentioned it. 32,000 different denominations, blah, 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 blah. It's totally irrelevant. Why? Because, as I said, illusion of formal rigor. That is an illusion of formal rigor. It sounds like you're offering up a devastating critique of religion in general, Christianity in particular. But once somebody starts to learn a little, you find out it is a critique without content. It is an irrelevant talking point of no substance or merit whatsoever. Ostensibly, what we are discussing, Christian versus atheist, is the ontological status of God. And every one of her critiques, every one of her seemingly devastating criticisms of Christianity are completely irrelevant to what? To the ontological status of God. Take the 32,000 different denominations. I forget if that's the exact number she used, but every one of you has heard the talking point, right? So I'm not lying when I say you could have copied and pasted her, put her in a YouTube video today, and you go, yeah, somebody today just said that on Twitter, right? There's all these different denominations. It's not relevant. Take the most famous argument between the denominations, Roman Catholicism versus Eastern Orthodoxy. Now that is a contentious, that caused a schism in the entire church, separated the church into two branches going back 1,000 years. That is one of the most famous of the religious quarrels. Well, what's interesting about it, if you know anything about it, this is what I say. Once you start learning some of this stuff, you realize these are criticisms without content. They aren't relevant to what? To the ontological status of God. The most famous of the theological disagreements, or one of the most famous, it's probably the most famous actually, it could be the most famous, Eastern Orthodox versus Roman Catholicism, going back almost over 1,000 years. Caused a big schism, circa, 1042 or something like that? I don't know the exact date. Caused Catholicism to branch off into two separate bodies. What are they arguing about? Do they believe in God? Yeah. Is their version of God? Their version of God is basically identical. Talk to a Roman Catholic today, talk to an Eastern Orthodox. They have big disagreements, but they aren't ontology. They both agree in God, that God exists, and they both agree that Jesus is God. So the idea that their disagreements are somehow relevant or a justification for atheism is ludicrous. That's my point. It is a criticism without content. That's what I said, illusion of formal rigor. It sounds like she's firing on all 5 cylinders, saying something that's really smart, when she isn't. She's offering up standard issue talking points that haven't changed in years. 1984 this video came out. 20 years ago. And that talking point hasn't changed, and it has been without content the entire time. It offers no justification for atheism whatsoever. Why? Because it is not about ontology. The disagreements between the different branches of Christianity, for the most part, I'll tell you what the Eastern Orthodox Catholics, I'm not an expert, but I know basically what they debate. Okay, the Eastern Orthodox, they get their marching orders from the Church Fathers. Orthodoxy, that's what the Church Fathers say is how they view theology. In Roman Catholicism, it's the Pope. That's a big bone of contention. Centralized authority in Roman Catholicism. A big bone of contention. The infallibility of the Pope. What's that got to do with the ontological status of God, Greg? Nothing. Exactly nothing. That's my point. It is a criticism without content. The other thing they talk about, filioque, I don't really know the details of it. Something about what's the actual nature of the Son of God? Is he eminent from the Father? Was he pre-existent? I forget the exact nature of that dispute. There's a handful of things that they talk about all the time. The other one is natural theology. All the Roman Catholics tend to be heavily influenced by Thomism, and the Eastern Orthodox are influenced by their Church Fathers, and their Church Fathers are more, if you say Platonic or Neoplatonic, you'll get pushback from the Eastern Orthodox. They have a different type of theological construct. And there's a couple of key differences. They believe in the nous, that I actually agree with the Eastern Orthodox on, by the way. They have a concept known as the nous, which is kind of like a spiritual knowing that I think is on point. And then they have a concept known as the logi, or that's basically, it's somewhat parallel in Roman Catholicism, but these are the differences. My point is, these differences are profound, but they have nothing to do with the ontological status of God. So to offer them up as some sort of justification for the position of atheism, it's a pseudo-justification at best. It has nothing to do with atheism. That's why I said the illusion of formal rigor. If you're actually going to be rigorous, and someone says, why are you an atheist? You got to cut to the chase. Now, fast forward to today, and nothing has changed. But in today's world, if you're going to actually be rigorous, instead of offering a facsimile, let's try and pretend like we're rigorous by saying things that sound smart but are irrelevant. Does everyone understand how that's irrelevant? The things that she offered up of justifications for atheism, that's what ostensibly she was being asked. Why are you an atheist? And she basically said, I had no answer, but here's some intelligent sounding criticism of Christianity. And I get it. There's a reason why it worked. Why? Because it seemed to be really intelligent. And if you were sitting in the audience as a fundamentalist Christian, you're kind of struggling at church, because they stupid itchy church pants. I'm so sick of church. They tell me I listen to New Kids on the Block. I'm going to burn in hell. And I love New Kids on the Block, man. I'm not putting down my New Kids on the Block. And you're all like, toyed out because your religion is like too confining. This is like catnip to those people. That's why it worked. That's why it connected. Why? Because it was going mass market, Oprah Winfrey, and it was offering something that seemed at first glance, if you don't know any better, to be a criticism on all 5 cylinders. It's only when you start investigating that you realize it is a criticism without content. And that criticism without content has not changed or altered at all in 20 years. Fast forward to today. You have Steven Tiger. Did everybody see this tweet? It's a really doozy, funny tweet, and you got to read the response if you haven't seen it. It's a must-see. It's where he goes like, fellow atheists, I'm paraphrasing, something about ignore the gotcha apologists. That's us, the Christian apologists. We're the gotcha apologists who try and get you to adopt atheism as a belief. Basic gist of the point is, do not ever now or assert God does not exist or adopt propositional atheism. Again, illusion of formal rigor. There's only one way on earth. The only thing ever being discussed between a theist and an atheist is what? Theist, atheist. God either exists or God does not exist. If you studiously avoid the idea that you are not going to positively assert that God does not exist, why? For the reason he states, to avoid the burden of proof, by your own words. Now, not every atheist does this, but there's a whole bunch of them that do. By your own words, almost every atheist holds to this paradigm. I want to believe that which is true, and I proportion my belief to the evidence. And when we are dealing with the proposition God does not exist, and you say, provide some evidence, they literally tell you no. So by your own words, by your own thoughts, by your own paradigm of reality, that should weaken your confidence in the proposition God does not exist. It's that simple. Your head can fall off as much as you want. This is not a contest. Steven Tiger acted like this is a contest between atheists and Christians. It is not. If you see it as such, I understand that it plays out as a contest here. That's why I used to say some of this politics. Remember I said that a long time ago, very witty, very intelligent, very insightful. Go look up some of my old videos. Some of my old videos are really good. Don't be deceived by the fact that my new videos are so great that you're not going to go digging into the older videos because they're really good. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. It is a very, very weird thing. Every atheist holds to the paradigm, I want to believe that which is true and I proportion my belief to the evidence. And then when asked to provide evidence for the proposition God does not exist, they say that's not their job. They literally say, okay, you can't prove a negative. Yes, you can. That's a misnomer. Yes, you absolutely can prove a negative. Theoretical physicists, that's the very nature of it. But I'll mention this briefly. Russell's paradox, Russell's teacup is deeply misleading. A teacup you can't prove that a teacup of the imagination isn't out there in Alpha Centauri 6 or wherever he placed it. But as soon as you ascribe attributes and locality, you can literally prove a negative. Why? Because the attributes have to match the locality. Duh. There's no teacup on Alpha Centauri 6. Why? What are the properties of the teacup? Very simple to prove it's not there. What are the properties of the teacup? What's it made out of? Then it can't survive. It's that simple. There you go. Russell's teacup, debunked. What's it made out of? If it's made out of a normal porcelain, it can't be there. Why? Because it wouldn't survive. Hello? He kind of fabricates an argument and pretends that a teacup is just some sort of imaginary thing. People do this all the time when they talk about the spaghetti monster, by the way. Pay attention to this, because atheists do this all the time. They'll say, I could just substitute the word spaghetti monster. Then they start giving the spaghetti monster the exact attributes of God, which means it's indistinguishable from God. You start giving it you start building a theological construct and you call it spaghetti monster. You're not changing the idea of God. It's the same idea. It's the same theological construct. They do that a lot. So again, this is not the point of the video. Just to reiterate, Russell's teacup is deeply misleading. You can prove a teacup doesn't exist in Alpha Centauri. Why? Attributes and locality. They have to go together. If they can go together, then it's hard to prove that it doesn't exist. But a teacup can't exist in outer space. Depends on what the teacup's made out of. If it's made out of the invisible fibers of his imagination, sure, then you can never falsify it. But if it's made out of actual porcelain or whatever a teacup is made out of, guess what? It can't be there. Why? Because it wouldn't survive. It's that simple. How do I know there's not a man, a human being floating around in outer space? Well, there may have been for a while, but he ain't there anymore. Why? Because he died and evaporated. It's that simple. He died and evaporated. He's not there. If he's a normal human being, no, he's not there. He died as soon as he hit the atmosphere and then he evaporated. You can't prove a negative, Craig. Yes, you can. It's a misnomer. The idea that it's really, really hard to prove the negative, God does not exist, should tell you something. Exactly what you said. I want to believe that which is true, and I proportion my belief to the evidence. If nobody can provide any good evidence for the proposition God does not exist, and guess what? Nobody can. There's only one argument that ever gives any, and that's the logical problem of evil, the natural problem of natural evil, as opposed to the problem of moral evil. That offers some prepositional justification for the proposition God does not exist. Now, the thing is, the dumb guy atheists are effectively right. I don't want to side with the dumb atheists who are usually the lack theists. The smart guy atheists are all trying to get them to think propositionally. God does not exist. And then there's side things to this where the smart guy atheists are 100% correct. Where they're the ones that say that atheism is polysemous, it can be defined a whole bunch of different ways, we just prefer this definition. And the other guys come in. There's a whole debate on it with, I forget what his name was. He's a smart guy. He's almost an answers from reason guy. It's Greek. Sisyphus, he's labeled himself after the guy who flies to the sun. Ichabod, Icarus, I forget his name. But he got into a debate with one of these guys, and he was 100% correct. He even provided all the evidence. Atheism is polysemous. The word can be defined many different ways. You want to define yourself as a lax theist? Be my guest. I just don't find the definition all that useful. That's literally what he said, practically word for word. There's nothing to argue with. He's correct. The other guy was saying, no, you can't. And then wouldn't listen to reason. Started saying ridiculous stuff to justify his position. The dictionaries are biased. Dictionaries are biased. What? Who says that? Dictionaries are biased? It gave him like 15 different versions of the definition of atheism. Yeah, lacktheism can be a version. I don't care how you define yourself as an atheist. The other guys are right, though. Because if you are trying to be formally rigorous, this is why I said, going back to the beginning, do you remember I said she was offering the illusion of formal rigor? Formal rigor entails that you strip away things that are not substantively about what? Proposition. God exists versus God does not exist. If it doesn't offer evidentiary justification for the proposition God exists, it is not an argument against ontology. Period. End of discussion. Now, even the smart set atheists fall down on these regards. Why? Because they think their arguments are better than they are. And it's, this is complicated, I'll give you. And a lot of people may take umbrage with this because it's getting into difficult areas. This is difficult. This is a teachable moment. I saw Dan Barker on Oprah Winfrey. I thought there's a lot here to talk about. So, for example, the smart set atheists all love the hiddenness argument. Now, why do they love the hiddenness argument? The hiddenness as a justification for your personal non-belief is probably really strong. I get it. If you were in church and they told you, you do X, Y, Z, P, D, Q, and God's going to show up in your life with power and authority, and you'll know that it's God, hallelujah, praise you, thank you, Jesus, and you're listening to those testimonies, and you think you're walking the walk, and you're praying, and you're fasting, and you're doing all the things your church is telling you to do over a series of years, which this is the case with a lot of these atheists, and no God shows up as far as you know. As far as I know, no, God never showed up. Kept praying and praying and praying. That's how Tyler Vila was saying. That was his justification for he calls it deconversion, but apparently he's still a theist, so deconstruction. So if you're going to the prayer closet and you're drawing blanks, and that happens over a series of years, and as far as you can tell, you're non-resistant, you want to believe in God, and God ain't showing up, yeah, it's perfectly normal for you to go, you know what, maybe there isn't a God to show up. That's kind of Paul Agea's story. That's kind of a lot of these people's story. I think Paul Agea at one point really wanted, to know God was real. God, if you're real, I want to know you. He may even said that prayer, I think, maybe. Wouldn't surprise me. So if you're going to the prayer closet and you're drawing blanks over a series of years, it is natural for you to at one point go, you know what, maybe there isn't a God. I identify, and I think that is a strong justification on a personal level. Okay? If that were the case with me, if I were, at church and they were telling me do X and I was doing X and I was following all the things that they said, dotting all the I's, and I wasn't having powerful experiences with God, guess what I'd be agnostic to? I don't know if I'd be an atheist. Why? I don't have taste for babies. I don't really enjoy them. That's your thing. Some of my things. Just dot that into them. But I'd be agnostic too. Back before I met God, I was agnostic. I'm having the opposite experience in my life. I go to my prayer closet and I have powerful experiences that are 100% real to me. You can believe or not believe that, but that's just what I'm experiencing. You can believe that, I'm deluding myself, that there's something there, but that's irrelevant. I'll get into arguments for that later on. The point is, as a personal justification for your lack of belief, it's probably pretty strong. When you try to change it into a formal argument, it fails immediately. Why? Because we can't know that you're non-resistant. We believe that you think you're non-resistant, but in order for the argument to succeed as a formal argument, remember I said at the beginning, the illusion of formal rigor. To be formal rigorous, you have to deconstruct and think clearly and analytically correct. Propositionally, does this add evidentiary justification to the proposition God does not exist? The hiddenness argument cannot. Why? Because we have to know as an established fact that all of these atheists are actually non-resistant non-believers. We have to know. We can't just take their word for it that they dotted all the T's and they did what the church told them to do. We have to know that church was telling them to do the correct things for people to actually experience God. There's a lot we have to know. And it just will never work as an argument. It's a strong justification for your personal lack of belief. I understand that. I endorse that. You're correct. As I said, if I were you and I were going to church and it was 10 years and they were saying, go to your prayer closet, cry out to God, I was pretty convinced that nothing happened. Guess what? I'd be agnostic too. I'd be like, yeah, nothing had to happen. I'd be totally on board. So as a personal justification, it's fine. It is not evidence for ontology. Why? Because it has to be formally rigorous in order to do that. Rigor means rigor. You can't sidestep that part. Ditto for another favorite of the smart set is the meager moral fruits of Christianity. Okay, irrelevant. Irrelevant to what? To ontology. Think of it very simply. Can God exist and can Christians be totally immoral at the exact same time? Yes. They aren't listening. The book says to do X, and guess what? They ain't doing it. It's not all that complicated, actually. Pretty much standard issue church today. The Bible says love your neighbor as yourself. You go to church and they're all hateful hypocrites. Wait, you guys are all hateful hypocrites. God must not exist. No, we're not listening. No, God exists just fine. We don't pray. We don't like him. We don't like him just like you don't like him. We don't listen to him because we don't want to love everybody. We're hateful hypocrites. That's, I'm being a little funny, but that's the basic gist of that. It's not an argument against ontology. Neither of them are. It's really, really hard. I can't stress this enough. This is why you should have a little bit more respect for the lack of belief people who just want to stay on Team Atheist. That's really what they're telling you. We don't really want to dig deep. Why? Because we want to stay on Team Atheist. And if you dig deep and you apply formal rigor, guess what? There's a really good chance you won't stay on Team Atheist. Because the first thing you're going to notice is there ain't no good justification for the position. There's none. The only one that offers a little bit of evidentiary justification, I promise you guys, unpack it correctly. Don't unpack it like a team player. If you don't believe me, eventually Joe, the Answers from Reason crew will eventually, once they start dealing with arguments, so far they don't deal with this stuff, but once they start dealing with arguments, they'll tell you the truth. You can go take it from their word. Why? Because they'll see it clearly. They don't offer evidentiary justification for the proposition God does not exist. As soon as you line it up propositionally, it's easy to see. The one that I always cite, I'm not talking about the gimmicky arguments that the dopey atheists use, like the Old Testament scripture, the angry Old Testament God. That's a terrible one. Why? Just think of it propositionally. Can God exist, and can there be challenging scriptures in the Old Testament at the exact same time? Yes. Therefore, it is not a justification for atheism at all. Does not offer one scintilla of a piece of evidence for the position God does not exist. Doesn't offer any justification for atheism. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to do. I think it's really hard, based off your own paradigm of morality, that you should weaken your confidence in the proposition. It doesn't mean you have to become a Christian. It doesn't mean you become a believer. It just means you tone it down a little. If it were easy to do, it would be done. There'd be arguments out there. There are none. There's one. The argument for natural evil. And, Christians can counter it. It's not all that ringing. It's really not. It's not that great. It's okay. It's got a little bit of a justification. It's more about how God operates in the world than it is about ontology. It's about what is the nature and character of God more than it is about does God exist or does not exist. But this is why it was interesting to go back in time, 1984. The reason why, it's really obvious why atheism took root. This brand of atheism. That's the new atheism style atheism that the Four Horsemen all became, that basically created a huge run-up in the amount of atheists. It's easy to see why it took root. It offers the illusion of formal rigor. Part of its appeal may be that it doesn't actually offer formal rigor. So you can just sound smart and think you're nailing it when you're not. You're not really investigating clearly. That could be a huge part of the appeal. But it's not. At first glance, it sounds like a devastating critique of religion in general, Christianity in particular. 32,000 different denominations, they can't agree on anything. And it was hard for the people in the audience to answer these atheists. It was really hard. But at some point, it's going to be easy. It's getting easier. Why? Because the arguments haven't changed in 20 years. As I said, more than 20 years. 1984. What year is it now? That's a lot of years. That's a lot more than 20 years. A lot more. Almost 40 years. And nothing's changed. You could copy and paste Dan Barker and his wife and put them in a YouTube video today. Nothing will have changed. And in the meantime, there's a cottage industry of apologetics that's grown to try to answer some of these questions. And we're getting to the point where some of them are getting successful answers. And there ain't any other arguments waiting in the wings. The ones favored by the smart set aren't that great. And if you're a smart set person, I apologize. I have no qualms with your behavior. You can believe whatever you want. But if you want to do this correctly, you have to recognize the truth of what I'm telling you. The formal rigor entails and demands that you see clearly that the arguments don't actually work all that well. If it were a strong evidentiary justification for the proposition God exists, guess what? It would rattle my cage. I'd tell you the truth immediately. I don't see how it could rattle my cage because I'm pretty sure God does exist. But it would rattle my cage and I'd tell you the truth immediately. They aren't. They aren't. And they fail on the grounds that I told you they fail. If you don't want to unpack it and see it for yourself, you don't have to. But I'm telling you the God's honest truth. They don't really work as arguments, as personal justifications. There's a reason why these people are desperately clinging to the lack of belief. It's easy to personally justify your lack of belief. You don't have to prove it to anybody, including yourself. You can just run off in the mouth about how stupid Christians are and how... That's basically what the meager moral fruits is. Christians are so mean and rotten and hypocritical. How could there be a God? You run mouth with the mouth. That's why they want to cling to their lack of belief. Why? Because it doesn't require anything of you. But if you want to climb up the mountain and become a real thinker and philosopher, and you want to actually apply formal rigor and offer something other than just the illusion of formal rigor, then you're going to have to think propositionally. And you've got a real challenge ahead of you. Well, it's really hard to do. There is no such thing. And I said this before, and people tried to counter it with do not counter this with another gimmicky, here's what it says in the Old Testament argument. Analyze the argument correctly and see that it actually offers no evidentiary justification for the proposition God does not exist. In order for it to be an ontological argument, it has to evidence that. It's really hard to do. That's why even smart people, the smartest people on planet Earth, Bertrand Russell, came up with the paradox that is deeply misleading rather than face square on the idea that it is really hard to do. It made him uncomfortable, I guess. Is he one of those people who said he doesn't want there to be a God? Because other than that, I can't understand it other than motivated reasoning. Russell's teacup falls apart immediately. It's an illusion of an argument. It's not an argument at all. It's a deeply misleading gimmick. The only reason I could think anybody would hold to it is because motivated reasoning. Oh, yeah, you can't falsify God. Yeah, you could falsify. That's the whole premise of the argument for natural evil, trying to falsify. The environment has to match the attributes. That's how you falsify. That you can falsify some God models. That's smart atheists will tell you that, and they're correct. You can falsify some God models. Well, how? Because the attributes has to match the environment. A teacup can't exist in Alpha Centauri. Why? Because a teacup isn't made out of nothing. It's made out of something. Okay, that something can't be there. You falsified it right then and there. What's a teacup made of? Porcelain. Okay, porcelain can't survive in outer space. End of Russell's teacup. I don't know why nobody notices. It's really obvious. It's really obvious. It's not like, it doesn't take any thought. It's immediately obvious. No, the teacup is made out of something that teacups are generally made out of, porcelain, china, whatever. It can't exist out in outer space. End of discussion. So, there you have it, kids. Just a little fun thing I picked up. I would advise you check it out. Go watch Oprah Winfrey. And, the Christians all struggled because at first glance, this seemed like a real challenge. And it actually wound up waking up a whole industry now known as Christian apologetics. And then you start to see that there isn't really a challenge in a lot of this stuff. Most of it is irrelevant. Most of it is gimmicky, smart-sounding oakum. Irrelevant garbage. The first 4 of the 10 Commandments aren't that great, okay? That's not relevant. I forget what her argument was. They aren't that moral. So, anyways, just a little fun video. Thought everyone would get a kick out of it. Go check it out. Oprah Winfrey, Dan Barker, our little friend Dan Barker. He went on to become one of the worst of the New Style atheists, actually. That's how the subject came up. Because most of his arguments are predicated on this gimmicky flim-flam. He's the worst when it comes to the Old Testament arguments. So, anyways, there you have it, kids. That is all for now. Mass is ended. Again, go in peace. Amen.